Friday's inflation data number was so bad that the U.S. federal government, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, or as I call it, the BS, is already planning in the next month of changing how they measure the CPI by using old consumer price data from 2019. And this is a screenshot from their website. I saw a friend post it over on Twitter. And also, on Monday, G7 finance ministers are planning an emergency virtual meeting, and one of the main topics is going to be discussing inflation. And this change that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is planning to use old consumer price data from 2019 when there was a lot less inflation, that is a big part of the lie component of stagflate tax lie. So it appears that this emergency G7 finance minister meeting that's going to occur on Monday is going to be discussing coordinating between Wall Street banks, CNBC, Bloomberg, and these government entities about how to hide more and more inflation, because the current inflation data, whether that's in the US, the Consumer Price Index, or as I call it, the Changing Propaganda Index, or the PPI, which is the Producer Price Index. I put a screenshot there showing the latest PPI or Producer Price Index numbers with double-digit stagflation rates in many different countries in Europe and very high single-digit rates. And those aren't the real numbers, let's be honest here. So this U.S. inflation, consumer inflation number of 6.8%, it seems high. It's not the real number. Even hedge fund manager Bill Ackman, and I just put screenshots there, is showing how owner's equivalent rent is totally false. USA Today ran a story a couple weeks ago. Rents in smaller U.S. cities were up for the first time in history, 30% or more in a calendar year. Insane. So hedge fund manager Bill Ackman, he went on a Twitter rant in the last 24 hours. Maybe hedge fund manager Bill Ackman has heard my stagflate tax lie thesis, but the lie component of stagflate tax lie has to do with phony economic data, moving the goalposts, changing the rules, changing how GDP is measured, changing how inflation is measured, and changing the jobs numbers and unemployment numbers. All this stuff is phony or fake, and it appears that it's about to become even more phony or fake. Look at the screenshot about how the January 2022 CPI weighting is about to change. It will be calculated based on consumer expenditure data from 2019. Also, according to Shadow Stats, the Consumer Price Index measuring inflation from the old 1970s and 80s numbers shows that inflation year over year is up well over 14% already, not the 6.8% number that was released on Friday. But the majority of the surging prices were for food, energy, and rent. But that's not the real number for rent, because the owner's equivalent rent, and Bill Ackman, congratulations to Bill Ackman for being red-pilled and figuring this out. The owner's equivalent rent is a phony, false, it is a fictional formula. If the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Federal Reserve wanted to be accurate, they could go to the National Realtors Association and they could get an accurate view of rents that way. And that's actually what's being quoted in a lot of these other articles, with the USA Today article a couple weeks ago and elsewhere about rents, not what the phony government statistics are talking about. So I would not be shocked in the near future, especially after this emergency G7 finance minister meeting, if they start to announce new types of inflation formulas. And they're already changing the formulas, but my point here is that because of the amount of currency and credit that's been created in the last 20 months, they cannot hide the inflation nearly as easily as they were in the past. And there was a lot of stagflation in the past. It's just that the amount of it has accelerated in a short amount of time over the last 20 months. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content research, financial education, and analysis than I'm providing in this short little free video, there are now over 190 articles and audio podcasts behind the paywall, exclusive for my patrons, all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee per month, only $5 a month. I think it is one of the best deals out there. And just in the last 23 or so weeks, there are now 35 new articles and audio podcasts, including 5 new audio podcasts out in the last 2 or so weeks. A uranium market update, Q3 earnings for the gold miners, geopolitical risk, in different countries that is rising with taxes and environmental permits pulled for some miners in Mexico. So I talk about that with Fortuna Silver. And then also an update on Sandstorm Gold's feasibility study for Hod Maden and how they have their environmental permits. Construction will be starting for Sandstorm Gold's best asset in the next couple months. That's an enormous royalty when that comes online. And then I just put out in the last 24 hours another new short little audio podcast on how institutional investors, which chase short-term returns, they base their current investments or trades on past performance, which is not very smart, but they're liquidating gold stocks right now. They've been doing so for the last couple weeks, according to sources. So that is why gold stocks have sold off, even though the paper gold price in US dollars has basically been in a trading range. So that is why gold stocks are selling off. It's a combination of institutional investors liquidating all of their gold stock positions, even though valuations are attractive, and some of these gold companies like Franco-Nevada, Wheaton Precious Metals, others are still minting money. And then also retail investors and retail traders are piling on to that with tax loss selling. So that is all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee per month, only $5 a month. Definitely check that out. And there will probably be more 10 to 20 minute audio podcasts exclusive for patrons in the near future, a uranium market update in the next week or two, and then a natural gas audio podcast on some natural gas opportunities, because I think natural gas is starting to get cheap. I'm more bullish on uranium and natural gas long term than I am on oil. So those will probably be the next pieces of new content exclusive for patrons. So if I could wrap up this short little video very quickly, it appears that the phony government economic data with inflation, whether that's here in the United States or in many other Western countries, they've created so much currency and credit the last 20 or so months. And all this currency and credit, it's inflated asset prices. There's less actual goods and services in the real economy. So more currency and credit chasing less goods and services means a lot of inflation, or as I see stagflation, you have rising costs on rent, you have rising costs on labor, you have enormously rising costs on food and energy. All these rising costs, the people in power, it does not fit their narrative. The governments and central banks, the bureaucrats, the regulators who don't get fired for the most part, it does not fit their narrative that inflation is only temporary. So what will they do? It appears they're going to be changing the inflation formulas again. And they will change the inflation formulas as many times as possible to fit a specific narrative. I know people don't want to hear this. I know a lot of people out there think that governments are trying to do the right thing and governments are inherently good, but we're seeing the brutal, ugly nature of what happens when governments have too much power, of what happens when governments are too big. It just leads to more waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. It leads to more propaganda. In this case, it's economic propaganda. And a big part of this, my stagflate tax lie thesis, a big part of this is the lie component. And one of the major parts of that is lying with government economic data, whether that's GDP, whether that's inflation, whether that's jobs and unemployment. The government has certain goals or narratives, and the government will change the rules, move the goalposts, do whatever it takes to fit the narrative. And it appears that this is why the governments are starting to panic, because they're looking at things like the producer price indexes that are showing insane amounts of stagflation. And they don't want the sheeple waking up to the reality of how bad things are. So they will lie even more. They will do even more propaganda, and they will keep repeating the lies and the propaganda and hope more and more people believe it.